Now in this section we will talk about hypothesis testing. Okay, we will see an example what is hypothesis testing, and we'll walk through an example in a very detailed manner. So hypothesis testing or significance testing is a method for testing a claim or hypothesis about a parameter in a population using data measured in a sample. Now, a hypothesis is a proposed explanation. It is to explain why something in our data looks the way it does. Despite the importance of hypothesis testing, it is infrequent for a data scientist today to actually be doing any kind of hypothesis testing. Now, many commonly used models, including linear or logistic regression, already make use of hypothesis testing and abstract the end user of those models from it. Even if we get the best sort of powerful modeling techniques like regression, we have got to understand how hypothesis and hypothesis testing work. There are well-established hypothesis testing procedures present. We need to find the correct one for our use case and go ahead and implement it. There are 4 steps of hypothesis testing. The first one is state the hypothesis. Second is set the criteria for a decision. The third is compute the test statistic, and the last one is make a decision. So let us take an example of a hypothesis testing procedure. So first we will do is we will start by defining the null hypothesis as H0. So this would be our first step, state the hypothesis. Let's say if I write over here H0, this is our null hypothesis, and the example what we are going to walk through is for children watching TV in India. We state that the null hypothesis that children in India watch an average of 3 hours of TV per week. Okay, so H0 is our null hypothesis, and what we are considering is children in India watch TV for 3 hours. So this would be our null hypothesis over here. So this is a starting point so that we can decide whether this is likely to be true. The basis of the decision is to determine whether this assumption is true. So in hypothesis testing, we start by assuming that the hypothesis or claim we are testing is true. So in this case, we will start by assuming that the children in India watch TV for 3 hours. The null hypothesis, stated as H0, is a statement about population parameter such as population mean that is assumed to be true. Once we have the null hypothesis, now we can define the alternate hypothesis. So let us write H1 and we can consider this as our alternate hypothesis. Okay, in this case what we can write is the children watch more than 3 hours of TV. Second, what we can write, children watch less than 3 hours of TV. Okay, and now when we are uncertain of the direction, we can state that the value in a null hypothesis is not equal to 3, as in children does not watch TV for 3 hours. So how we can write this? Here you can write not equal to 3. Okay, so we have stated our null hypothesis and alternate hypothesis. So we have completed the first step. The first step was to state the hypothesis. Now the second step is to set the criteria for a decision. Step number 2. Set the criteria for a decision. To set the criteria, we state the level of significance for a test. In hypothesis testing, we collect the data to show that the null hypothesis is not true based on the likelihood of selecting a sample mean from a population. The level of significance is typically set at 5%. When the probability of obtaining a sample mean is less than 5%, if the null hypothesis were true, then we conclude that the sample we have selected is too unlikely, and so we reject the null hypothesis. The third step would be to compute the test statistic. Test statistic is a mathematical formula to determine the likelihood of obtaining sample outcome if the null hypothesis were true. The value of the test statistic is used to make a decision regarding the null hypothesis. So now the fourth step would be to make a decision. This is our final step. If the probability of obtaining a sample mean is greater than 5% when the null hypothesis is true, then the decision to retain the null hypothesis. Okay, then we can take the decision to retain or reject the null hypothesis. So a researcher can take two decisions. First one is reject the null hypothesis. Here, the sample mean is associated with the low probability of occurrence when the null hypothesis is true. If you retain the null hypothesis, the sample mean is associated with the high probability of occurrence when the null hypothesis is true. Now, the probability of obtaining a sample mean given the value stated in the null hypothesis is true is stated by the p-value. Okay, this is very important. P-value. Now, if the p-value is a probability which varies between 0 and 1. When the p-value is less than 5%, if this p-value is less than 5%, or you can say if it is 0.05, in that case we reject the null hypothesis. Also, if the value is equal to 0.05 or 5% over here, we still reject the null hypothesis. Now, if the p-value is greater than 5%, or if it, you can say if it is greater than 0.05, in that case we retain the null hypothesis. Okay, so let us quickly go through the total steps what we had. If we talk about the null hypothesis, there are 4 steps. The first one is to state the hypothesis. The second is set the criteria for a decision. Third is compute the test statistic. And last one is to make a decision. So in our case, what we did is we created a null hypothesis. What our example was that children in India watch TV for 3 hours. So we considered that as our null hypothesis. It is represented by H0. Children in India watch TV for 3 hours. Then what we did is we created a alternate hypothesis wherein we wrote that children watch more than 3 hours, children watch less than 3 hours, and children does not watch TV for 3 hours, which is not equal to 3. Okay. The second step was to set the criteria. The third one was to compute the test statistic, and the last one was to make a decision. In this, if you obtain the p-value which is less than 5% or which is less than 0.05, you reject the null hypothesis. Also, in a case where the p-value is equal to 5% or 0.05, we still reject the null hypothesis. If the p-value is greater than 5% or it is greater or 0.05, then you retain the null hypothesis.